we have a very exciting show for all of you today. We have Corey Anton with us, and he is a professor at Grand Valley State University. And he specializes in not only media ecology, which is all about looking at how things like the alphabet, the mirror, the telephone, the camera, or even our social media has changed our perspectives of ourselves and how we communicate. But he also looks at semiotics, the study of communication, symbolism, and everything else. And what's very exciting is that I think he is one of the great intellectuals and thinkers of our time. I have been greatly impacted by his books. This is Selfhood and Authenticity here. Of course, we have Valuation and Media Ecology, Ethics, Morals, and Laws, something we could probably do a little more with these days. But also he has a new book out, How Non-Being Haunts Being, on Possibilities, Morality, and Death Acceptance. And this is very important as we explore these subjects today about social media, consciousness, our sense of identity, and how that all works. But first of all, I also want to mention to all of you that I'm feeling pretty good today because I'm taking the Neuro Buddha supplements. We got the lion's mane here, which is great for boosting focus and concentration. We have these cordyceps, great for energy. And if you guys head over to neurobuddha.com, you can use the coupon code Enoch20 to get 20% off your next order. And of course, do check out Light the Light Pyramids to get these beautiful Orgone pyramids to put on the end of your desk. You can turn your office into a miniature Giza plateau. But Corey, I want to hit the ground running here with you, and I want to jump right in, and I want to ask you, there's a popular theory out there these days. Many people believe, just like Plato's cave analogy, that we live in a simulation. Do you suppose it's possible that we are living in a simulation right now?
Okay, I guess that's an interesting question. I mean, I think in some way, language is the original matrix. That is, language is it's a socio-historical, it's a kind of transpersonal structure that organizes the way that we, I guess, conceptualize and think about our experiences. That, all organisms have various sensory apparatus that they perceive the world in its immediacy. And we do, we have our immediate senses, touch and taste and smell and this kind of stuff. But language introduces like a layer on top of that then enables objects that are perceived to be imaginatively like played with in this sort of mental workspace. I mean, it facilitates abstract forms of cognition. So I think the history of the notion that people are not just installed in their immediate environments, but are in some sort of simulated environment, I think goes all the way back to language and, the kinds of experience that are uniquely human, as opposed to just, other forms of animals. And we are animals. I mean, I think we're the product of evolution, but there's a particular kind of social, historical, technological environment that mediates our experience.
So obviously there's a connection with language and thought. We have this peristasis, or this oscillating thoughts all around us that our reality is being changed and decoded through. And when we look at how this works with these levels of entanglements and causal mechanics and changes, do you think that the type of language a person uses, and I'm posing it to you like this, because I want to say, do you think that the type of language changes a type of thinking? Because here where I live, in Budapest, Hungary, it's been said that folks have very high IQs. The Hungarians, without a doubt, have incredible inventions. They have given us the Rubik's Cube, the discovery of vitamin C, the helicopter, so many inventions. And they tell me that the reason for that is their language changes their type of thinking. Do you think there's anything to that?
I think there's a lot to be said of that. I mean, it's a somewhat controversial claim. It's often talked about as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it's been largely criticized by people of the Chomskyite tradition, people like Steven Pinker. I don't know if they've really given careful, fair account of what like Worf's actual position was or Sapir's position was. But I think many people in the media ecology tradition have tried to articulate some of that finer space there. And clearly, there are very, very subtle differences in the way we think by a particular language. But I think even above and beyond that, language itself as a kind of scaffolding for thought changes the way thought can function. I mean, you could take somebody like Andy Clark, where he's been able to demonstrate there's a kind of interpretation that leverages and focuses attention in different ways. You know, even something like, if I say righty tighty, lefty loosey, there's a way in which the language helps me recall how to function when I'm facing certain problems or contingencies. And I think you can also see stuff like, for example, Stanislas Dehaene, the neuroscientist out of I think France. He's in Paris. He's done a lot of work. His book, The Number Sense, or Consciousness in the Brain. He's done a lot of work showing that, infants and mammals, rodents, they have something like a conceptual apparatus for larger and smaller, or even for small quantities like oneness, two-ness, and three-ness. Like they're able to actually recognize the difference between a pile of two and a pile of three. And yet what they don't have is something like 98. And he talks about 98ness is a unique artifact of number lines. And, we're able to engage in very sophisticated forms of mathematics that it really wouldn't be possible without the physical structure of the pen and paper and the way that we do like cognitive offloading, where we're using the material world as part of the thinking process.
Well, first of all, you gave us a lot of different points to go off into and extrapolate there. I want to go into the idea of thought, and I want to bring it back down into language again. But with thought, it's very interesting because we have a lot of these technocrats now, and these guys in Silicon Valley. You have your Elon Musk saying he's downloaded a version of himself, and he's downloaded his thoughts and his memories. You have Ray Kurzweil saying that we are just like a mind file. And when we talk about thought, can we really quantify a thought? Can we go into the millions of neurons firing up into every direction? When people are talking now about downloading consciousness or downloading a version of themselves, do you suppose that what we're seeing as the outcome of that is that an exact version of themselves? Or is that like an NPC? Is that like an AI taking versions of their memories? What do you suppose are the implications of that?
Yeah, again, it's huge. It's almost mind blowing. We're in times of great change. I don't know if I'd want to weigh in and say that just blanketly. I mean, I guess we could come at it this way and say, will there ever be an artificial intelligence that is rivaling us or indistinguishable from our consciousness? I think I could be a hardline materialist, make no appeal to any religious dogma, and just say no and go, it's the wrong material. One of the later, see, this is as opposed to the early Chomsky. I think, I've seen some recent interviews with Chomsky, and he's done, I think, some really great redress to people like Chalmers and others who've suggested that consciousness poses a hard problem. And what Chomsky says is, no, it's almost the exact opposite of what people think. People act as if that like consciousness is nebulous and mysterious and ambiguous, and we can't really figure out what it is, but we have matter figured out. And it's almost like, no, we know what consciousness is directly from our own personal experiences. It's things like being tired, it's being hungry, it's feeling cold. There's all kinds of experiences that consciousness deals with. And that's what we directly experience. Our conscious, again, we have a conscious experience of what it's like to be cold or to be hungry or to be horny, whatever it is. Those are all very different than matter. I think matter is highly mysterious yet. We don't know really that much about what it is. And especially as you start to get into these issues of quantum foam and, various particles doing whatever they're doing. I think part of the issue is as well, it's a larger problem in that there's never simply a brain state. It's not as if the brain is just occurring in a vacuum. The brain is always occurring with there's atmospheric pressures, there's gravitational pressures, there are, ways in which the larger environment is always present, but it gets bracketed or forgotten. So when we start to talk about things like a thought in the head, well, I know, but that thought is in a head, and that head is on a body, and that body's in an environment, and that environment is in a larger world. And we need to get at the whole, like there's never been a thought independent of the entire universe, really.
Right. Exactly. And speaking of which, when you go back into the ancient philosophers, and I know you've looked at a lot of our modern philosophers like Heidegger and others, but if you look at the ancient philosophers, let's say Pythagoras, what Pythagoras would get his initiates to do is they would go back throughout the day and they would look at the causes of every cause throughout the day of how they cause something. Again, causal mechanics and cause and effect. And so one of the ancient philosophies, the greatest one they would look at was the first cause. And we can talk all about the Big Bang or expansion theory and all these sort of things. But do you suppose when we mentioned that there's no original thoughts, these thoughts are coming everywhere else, are we all a product of the first cause, or the universe experiencing itself subjectively? Where do you look at all of this coming in? Because you look at incredible things. You look at semiotics, media ecology, communication on the highest levels. Where does this all lead to? Is there a core that you've penetrated?
Oh boy, Johnny, these are tough questions. I personally do not subscribe to a pantheism. I don't believe that thought needs to go all the way down to the inorganic. For me, thought begins with life, but life is admittedly billions of years old, and it may have to, you're given this ad for mushrooms and whatnot. Like, I think we really don't know enough about the biome, about the way the body is it's a symbiotic conglomeration of many different organisms. Not only, did what we can see by the visible eye happen by symbiotic relationships and merging of different organisms, yes, but right now our body depends upon countless microbiota, go through the body. And, so it's not like you're worm food when you're dead. You're an edible home at all points. You're something, your life living on itself. But I think that it is right to get out of the notion that thought is something that an individual does inside an individual's head. I think there is something like a pool of thought that, the way to think about this is, when did you discover your name? My guess is you grew up kind of always knowing your name. And that was, again, implanted there from other people. Other people invented the language and passed it down, and then you acquired your mother tongue. And by the time you had acquired it, you had a sense of who you are, but others have so infiltrated your consciousness that you've been otherized from the inside out, right? So language was part of the condition of otherness that allowed you to come back to yourself as if you were another. And so I think in that sense, language is so much more than an individual.
That's incredible. And I definitely believe that you're onto something there, because again, in your books, you have mentioned, that we are sonorous beings. And getting into this, when we look at these parasynthetic harmonies, we look at how the universe works with, they're literally, if you look at you mentioned all these particles, like let's say subatomic particles and things that are in a constant state of vibration, a constant state of motion. Look at all these people that they go out and they listen to John Williams, or they listen to Adele, and they're just swaying back and forth, that they hear this incredible music, that it changes them on these various levels. Do you suppose that when we look at language and it's in its structure, and I know this gets complex, it gets very, very complicated on how we start to break this down. Do you suppose now that we're moving into this very cerebral cognitive world, that now we might have things like Neuralink, we might have these sort of other implants or ways of tapping into these networks, that learning might change? Or is it going to change the way we communicate or feel reality?
Oh, I would guess, yes, pretty significantly. In the same way that it's hard for us to just quickly, in a thumbnail sketch, clarify exactly how literacy has changed our experience of ourselves or of community or of consciousness. I think that the profound effects of literacy, they're oftentimes unnoticed. The changes, the noetic economy. There's less reliance upon rhythm and repetition and rhyme. There's a greater tolerance for novelty because there's less fearfulness of forgetfulness, right? That they're not as afraid of forgetting, partly because they're able to write things down. And I think part of the difficulty is when we think about literacy, we think of pen and paper. We don't think of the overall ways in which consciousness has been altered. I think one of the ways to get at it with the electric media would be to say that in times of electric interconnectivity, you'll never experience a fast modem. That is now, because the culture is moving so rapidly, we don't experience speed anymore. We experience, various forms of slowness. What I mean? It's now going so rapidly.
It's amazing how these have evolved and how our alphabets and languages have evolved. One place I go to a lot, obviously, is Egypt. And when we look at the hieroglyphics, it's very interesting that in these ancient languages, you'll see that the vowels aren't necessarily present. You see the consonants, but they were hidden as hidden aspects of God. It was thought that these were literally forms of the divine. And we see how symbolism has changed, how alphabets have changed in these exchanges. Where do you see this going? Do you see us going more symbolic nowadays as we've seen these emoticons and everything as we moved into that world?
I think there's a lot of evidence for that and this is sort of somewhat McLuhan-esque argument that there was an organic age, and then there was literate life, scribal life, print culture, and then when the telegraph hits, although the telegraph is a pretty sophisticated technology, in a lot of ways it recovers a new organicism. And so there's like the organic age and the mechanical age for thousands of years, and then a new organic interconnectivity through electricity. And I think what he would suggest, is very similarly, the writing systems, they were more pictographic, and then they grew into these very abstract phonetic forms of letters, and now you're seeing a resurgence of emoticons and other forms of internationally, they're what we understand and we share, but they're not really analytical in the way that phonetic text, print alphabetic text in particular. It really allows for a kind of analysis. One simple example of this, just maybe to be clear on this, is when Elizabeth Eisenstein did her 2-volume work called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. She was able to demonstrate that one of the real transitions that was so important for the development of science was what occurred as we went from manuscript culture to print. So the printed word allowed for an absolute identical copy of astronomical charts. And so prior to that, astronomy it was difficult to get off the ground because the calculations, that little tiny errors that were introduced into various copies. Once the printing press happened, right, mid 1400s, right around, you saw a gathering together of lots of different manuscripts, a sorting out of errors, and then a printing of standard agreed upon tables that paved the way for Galileo, Copernicus, and people to give incredibly accurate predictions of astral bodies. And once that happened, there was no denying sort of the scientific potency that was there, in the sort of discoveries that people were able to make and in the predictions that people were able to give.
Yeah, and one book that you had recommended in the past that gets into a lot of these things and the evolution of these processes was Kittler's Optical Media, which I have up there. And I want to take this conversation now to something that you've been very vocal about. You've looked into social media, and I just love your explanations of this when you talk about, even in the basic mode that people would use Facebook in with liking or going on Instagram, that there was this convergence of identity. And I love the way you break that down. And I want to share with the folks that are watching this at home a quote that you have put in your books that is one of my favorite quotes of yours that you use. That is, what Peter tells me about Paul tells me more about Peter than about Paul. And I would say that is applicable to this because we start to see this aspect of this in layers when we look on Facebook and other areas. Can you just break that down for a second for us of what's happened to people in the way that we communicate nowadays in the social media era?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me just say something about that quotation. So yeah, this is one of the insights when people come to terms with the fact that the knower and the known are inseparable, that everything that's known is known by someone, and that what you know and the thing you know that with, they're two aspects of the same thing. And so that means that whatever Peter tells me about Paul tells me more about Peter than Paul. It means whatever the self describes the self. That is, we reveal ourselves when we talk about things. When I talk about a dog, if I say that the dog is food or pet, I'm saying more about me and my culture than I am about that thing that I can point to, right? If I say that Jesus was the Son of God, people could go, well, this person is likely a Christian. If I say, no, Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but he was likely a prophet or something, well, then they say, well, you may be, of the Jewish faith or of a different tradition. But if you say that Jesus didn't exist, then people are going to say, well, you're likely an atheist, whatever. So there's ways in which, as we're talking, we're revealing ourselves. This is beautifully captured in the Bible with the origin of the word shibboleth, right? That if you pronounced it Sibboleth, you were killed at the scene, right? At the Nile, with the Canaanites and the Hittites were at war and this kind of stuff. So there's lots of ways in which we disclose ourselves when we talk about things. Now, that said, I think that there are, in the same way that there were to the authenticity movement, sort of boosters and knockers, I think there are boosters and knockers to the metaverse and to the promises of the internet, that some people see it as this amazing opportunity for new forms of self, for new forms of community that aren't constrained by the body and geography, and it's highly liberatory. Other people see this as a relentless extension of surveillance capitalism. The reason that Zuckerberg is interested in this is that he can't get good enough data on you by watching your Facebook maneuvers. He wants to see where your eyes are, where they're looking, how dilated they are. I mean, he wants the kind of information that's so intrusive that's much more valuable to the kind of algorithms and the information they're interested in selling. I mean, it's crucial to his business model. And I think people who are not familiar with Shoshana Zuboff's book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, they would do themselves, a real solid if they would get familiar with her and her work. I think some people do not understand, this notion of, if a service is free, you're the product. Well, that's not really the way that she would say it. She would say, well, the services are free, you're the raw materials that people are going to harvest, what's called data surplus or data exhaust, and they scoop it into these predictive products and the kind of algorithms that they'll use to sell that. And if you take something like Google will say that they don't sell your personal private information. And technically, if you look at the fine print, they're not. But what they're doing is they're harvesting all your information. They cook it according to some unknown algorithm, and then they sell that product. So they are selling the information that it's been manipulated with this, largely it's going to insurance companies and to various producers who are trying to sell you, products, but it's potentially going to law enforcement and other government agencies. I think people, if you look at someone who's worked like Evgeny Morozov, who wrote The Net Delusion and To Save Everything, Click Here, I think he has a better world or global perspective where people realize that all of this surveillance could be used potentially in nefarious ways by authoritarian regimes or governments that become increasingly totalitarian, which we see there's a rise across the country, across the globe. I think that was part of the problem with the internet as well. I think when the internet first happened, it was as if people imagined that the internet was synonymous with democracy, and just take any country and bring the internet to them, and you're going to bring democracy and topple dictatorships. And it's turned out to be almost the opposite, that these technologies can be used by governments to really clamp down on people, to survey, to censor, and to keep people in check and in line.
I'm absolutely certain of that. And I think there's a lot of people that are genuinely concerned that we are going to be entering a centralized digital currency. And when that happens, it'll work like a social credit score, right, where, there could be a very real censorship coming up. And, it's interesting when we start to look at these technological advancements and things like that. If you look at one of the things we've really been held back on is the wet cell battery. And if you look at even our own bodies, I have a friend of mine that pointed this out to me. He said, well, look at the back of your phone. It's like 30 milliwatts. He says, you give off about 100 watts. He goes, the human body gives off a lot of energy. And he said, the days of the cell phone are over. He goes, even the wearables, and who wears these smartwatches? No offense if some of you are wearing a smartwatch. It's like you could live without having your heart rate, right, on a watch. But you have these kind of things that are out there. And the people think that when we're talking out there about these new things like the metaverse, and they think that, we're going to be wearing these big clunky glasses out there. He says, no, it's going to be very, very quickly until you snort this small piece of technology that is an augmented receiver, an optical display that you could be sitting in the movie theater and everyone around you is watching a movie. You're answering a phone call, or you're showing someone what you're looking at, or you're navigating these cerebral-like worlds that you're fully immersed into another world if you want. And I wanted to ask you, you've pointed out the fact that just clicking on someone else's pictures and giving them likes or wanting to get likes is a convergence of identities. What do you suppose is going to happen to people's identity when they can become anything, or they can go on a roller coaster, they can have a sexual experience, they can immerse themselves into any part of the world? What's going to happen to people then?
Oh, I don't see, again, I don't see it with rose-colored glasses at all. I'm among the knockers. I don't find it to be, I think it's going to be problematic. Not only is it going to be like psychologically leading to people with even worse forms of interaction aversion and worse forms of like sort of social anxiety disorders and things like that, but just the kind of incoherence of what it means to be in a place, in a shared community, and what all that will mean. I think part of the difficulty, I would say, it's that well, let me back up and say, I think that we could make a distinction between people who are being somewhat productive, people who are non-productive, and people who are being counterproductive. And let's just sort of talk about that. So productive, I mean, something very simple. That is, there is a real world and it has real problems right now. There are people who, they need fences mending, they need bridges repaired, they need food, they need someone to plant food and to harvest that food and distribute it. And they need all kinds of resources, like the real world. And there are people who are productively trying to engage that world. They're rolling up their sleeves and they're doing that. Then there are people sort of non-productive. And this is more like attitudes than like a given individual. I think then there's this sort of non-productive attitude, which is people are laying around, they're snoozing, they're taking a nap, they're maybe watching the ball games, or they're just mindlessly scrolling through the TV, something like this. And then there's the counterproductive. This is the person who's actively cleaning the fish tank on their Facebook app, and they're lost in these kinds of things that take time, and they give the appearance of being productive. They make the person feel as if they've done a lot, but it doesn't amount to anything at all in the real world. It's a net level drag, and it's deceptive because it gives the illusion of something like, a productive day. Well, wow, look at me. I earned an extra, couple of points, and now I have a new starfish in my virtual tank in my Facebook account. I mean, I think part of it is it's because it's repressed. Humans have a need to be heroic. I think if there's anything that Ernest Becker has taught us, it's that the drive to heroism is very real. And that I think for many people, the forms of social anxiety, the forms of depression, certainly there's clinical relations here, and there are biological roots to some of this, especially if somebody has a family history of mental illness. But just in our world, increasingly, I think people suffer from lack of meaning, lack of relevance and purpose. And if they don't have real purpose, real goals, and then some adversity, some recalcitrance, some obstacle, then it's like life just bogs down into futility, and it seems senseless. And so it's hard to say that people need resistance and challenge, but I think they do. And I'm not sure if these online environments are going to give people the kinds of challenges that they need in order to really thrive as a person.
I completely agree with you. And again, you could find elements of that in selfhood and authenticity. And with that, there's a lot of inventions that we're going to get in the next little while that are no doubt going to change us forever. And whether we want them or not, we might come into them kicking and screaming. I think, for one, if people look up nanocarbon diamond batteries. We now have a breakthrough with batteries made from radioactive waste. These could literally charge your cell phone for thousands of years, and you would never need a battery. And this isn't science fiction. This is something we have right now. I believe that you'll see 3D printed and lab grown meats by the end of the decade. There's no doubt that we'll be told that that's a necessity. And they create it out of animal cells. I'm sure you've heard of this. They're perfecting it. There's a lot of things that we're working on, these sort of solutions out there. But speaking of that and where we're going with things, one thing I want to bridge into is the matters of your new book. And when we talk about the book, how non-being haunts being, on possibilities, morality, and death acceptance. You've said many times before in the past that our sense of this finitude, our death, the awareness of our death, gives us a sense of identity. Now, when we look at this concept, where I want to go in that with you, is that time is the fire in which we burn. And when we look at our lives in the sense that we have this limited amount of time on earth, that we have to accomplish something. And just like you said, I believe all of those elements you just talked about are very important, that if you have a bit of adversity in your life, if you go through a struggle, these things you appreciate things much more, and they really give you a sense of meaning and purpose. It's like if you talk to someone that grew up very, very wealthy with everything, later on in life, they don't appreciate it as much as someone who had to earn it. And that's a fact. And I think a lot of people are looking for a quick dopamine hit these days, whether it's through video games, through porn, through online activities. They just get that rush, and that gives them that sense of that feeling that they're doing something, but they're really not doing anything. They're not going out there and getting it. In your work in the past, you have also made mention that a lot of religions have given us temporal admonishments of looking at everything in temporality, that it fades away. But where I want to bridge over into this question with you, when we go back into what Ray Kurzweil is saying, he's Google's chief futurist, very brilliant man. He has talked about these things called foglets. And these are these nanoparticles, silicon hexagonal structures that are about 1 atom thick, and they can unlock the mitochondria in your cells. And in theory, in the future, supposedly, these will be a part of a lot of our medicine. I believe they already are, repopulating the optic nerve and everything. They will use the nitrogen and hydrogen from outside of your body to make eating and drinking optional. And in theory, in the future, would give great life extension. And if we had this possibility that people were living for very long periods of time, or they could go on, how will that affect the overall perception of a person's identity in that respect? And do you think it will change us as a whole?
Oh, it's a great question. I think it's a very, very formidable threat. This will not only be, I think these technologies that you mentioned, I think they are there. I think they're happening. I think people need to be aware of that. I think that's very right. Radical life extension may happen somewhat close we may see that in our lifetime. We may see radical life extension. I think it will be like anything, it will be subject to a kind of digital divide of the haves and the have-nots. So it's not going to be widely available to everyone. And try to think of what will that mean? What will life mean when it's no longer intergenerational, but a person lives to be 300 or 400 or 500 years? What will that mean for Social Security? What will it mean for employment? How exactly will that be negotiated in the case of it's a tyrant? So you now have a tyrant who's taken over a country, and the person lives for 500 years as a reign for several hundred years. I think we'd have to really think through all that's implied therein. And it may be that, yes, somebody could potentially live 300 or 400 years, but it's just going to make premature death seem even more of a travesty. So some young child gets hit by a runaway truck or something that, the whole body gets flattened. I don't think we're going to just regenerate it. And I think the idea, we're just going to take that consciousness and put it into a a kind of robot or a cyborg that's going to live, that gets even weirder. Then you're like, is that even me? I'm not even sure what that is. I think that our sense of graciousness, and again, I'm not going to speak against it. Like, I don't think it's probably somewhat inevitable that it is going to happen, but it's going to be fraught with injustices, with other kinds of anxieties and fears. A lot of people, they look forward to retirement, but then they're bored when it happens and they don't really know what to do with themselves. If some person has lots and lots of capital and is creative and wants to grow themselves, I could see it maybe being a desirable, but I think for many people, it's really not that desirable. I mean, it sounds desirable until they really start to think it through. You're going to make sure that all of your friends are getting it too, or are you're going to live and watch your friends die? I mean, it's sort of like the vampire stuff. I mean, I think the reason that we're so fascinated with vampires is that this stuff is sort of appearing on the horizon. And we do see that when people outlive their natural life, they become vampiric. That is, other people have to be sacrificed for their continuance.
Wow, that is profound. And I have one final question for you today, because I know you have to run soon. The question I want to ask you is that when we bring it back to Neuralink, the metaverse, interacting in these online worlds in this cerebral sense, how far off do you think we are from this? Because right now it's very T-model forward, but how far off do you think we are from that?
I don't think we're going to see that kind of stuff in my lifetime. I'm not going to see it. I think we are very likely to see radical life extension and some of those technologies. The metaverse or AI that would be indistinguishable from human, like, again, something like Blade Runner. That's from my own perspective. I mean, it could happen in my lifetime. I would see that as possibly hundreds years off, if it's at all possible. I don't think that I don't have any, like, it has to be impossible, but it just seems as if some of it is really fraught with like logical contradictions. Like, take, for example, David Levy's book, Love and Sex with Robots. When he published that, trying to think of when it was done. It was done, somewhere around the turn of the century. But he was predicting that Love and Sex with Robots was going to be mainstream by 2025, and that people were going to be mainstream. Everyone was going to be marrying a robot by 2050. I don't think anybody has that now at this point. And part of the difficulty was he was sort of saying, like his argument was like this. He would say, well, part of the reason people want a sex robot is because, they don't get enough opportunities to practice in sex, and that they want to be better lovers. But then he also wants to say, well, a robot is completely programmable, and you can change its hair color, its desires, its infidelity rates, all this kind of stuff at a little bit of a programming. Well, then you want to go, okay, well, why would anyone, if they're going to marry a robot, really be worried about their sexual performance then? They could just program the robot to be wildly enthusiastic about whatever you do. And so you start to realize that there's a sense of wanting to control other people, and that it's in robotic form, while also trying to grow oneself, and it like hits a loggerhead of contradictions there. I think there could be something like a sophisticated AI, but it's never going to be like us. It's going to be something radically different. It will be either radically far superior to us, and why would it want us as a friend, or it's going to be seen as something inferior, and just it's not the right material, and it's not going to be able to live up to the kind of complexities and nuances that we have in human interactions. It's going to be something very different.
I agree with you. And it's interesting because in Budapest here, where I live, there are robots inside our mall, and it's kind of cool. It moves its arm, it walks along with you, it will talk to you. We even have a robot cafe. It will take your order, it cleans the tables. It's quite impressive to see, but I think we're a ways off until we can fit a quantum computer inside of one of those heads, which is a ways off. And there is some stuff we're doing with AI that's very cool. A lot of people get scared with the word AI, but everyone's using AI. We're using AI right now. We're using it in our phones and our camera, with just about everything. I thought that Xenobot frog egg experiment was a little creepy on how they were teaching the AI how to replicate itself. Some military genius out there would try to do something like that down the road. I think that kind of stuff could get a little spooky, but overall, Yeah, I really like what you said also about the fact of this trying to control this thing, and where does that lead to our growth, and how does that evolve us and those connections and communication. Corey, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on here today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, well, thanks, John. It really was great. I mean, I guess I would like to say maybe one last thing and try to give a plug for
Please
media
do.
ecology here. I think what media ecology would say is that you want to take any technology, any medium of communication. It's not a thing in our environment. We're in the environment that it makes possible. So again, if we ask what is space and what is time, we can ask it in this philosophical question, like what do we mean by space, time, this kind of stuff. But if instead we say, what are the particular spatial and temporal dynamics that get opened and made manifest by any given communication technology, we find that we're in the space and time of that technology. So whether it's the alphabet and language, or it's the cell phone in my pocket, the phone in my pocket, it's not a thing that is in my pocket. I'm in the space and the time that it makes possible. And I think the more that people could understand that sort of media ecological orientation, the more they would see that as we open a new technology and introduce it to our life, it revolutionizes selves and societies because they start to move to different paces, different rhythms, different scales of connection.
I love that. And can you also tell people about the new book, why it's so important to this trilogy, as well as how they can find it? And everyone has to go out and buy a copy, as well as how they
Please
can find you.
go get a copy, of How Non-Being Haunts Being. I think the softback's coming available at the end of this month. Very excited about it. I think it's important because I think a lot of people are, in my own sense, they're not adequately going to have the gratitude if the only way they can accept life is if it has strings attached. My own belief is that when you're dead, you're dead. And I don't think that's a pessimistic, like, oh, that's horrible. I think for me, it makes sense. I don't feel like I need something more than having all the wonderful and amazing experiences that have come with being self-conscious and all the experiences I've had as a person. I think that the kind of argument that goes, well, unless there's life after death, none of this is meaningful, or this is all meaningless. I think, no, that can't be true. That just can't be true, because I don't know if there's life after death. My guess is that there's not. Again, I don't know, but I can tell that life is meaningful right here, right now. And it's because we're aware of the fact that we die. Now, is there something after? Again, I don't know. My guess is when you're dead, you're dead. But I feel great gratitude, even if there isn't an afterlife. And I kind of feel sorry. It's a bad thing to say, but I kind of feel sorry for people who need the promise of something other than life in order to appreciate and be grateful for life. I think they're actually not having gratitude. They're kind of holding themselves hostage in a promise for a happily ever after, when they need to be just grateful for what they have and try to take better care of each other. I mean, my own concern is people need to learn how to share and take turns. And those are like meta level, we're not very good at sharing, and we're not very good at taking turns. This is, I think, sort of like a sub theme of everything we were talking about there today.
I love that perspective on things. And my take on it, as you've heard me talk about it before, is that I think everything in nature exists with a purpose. And I really believe that we have these experiences and we go through life, and we're here to grow and evolve, and we learn from each other, and we have these things. And I've always kind of gravitated towards, this transmigration, or the idea that we might move as a consciousness, if consciousness is in fact has a non-locality factor to it, which I believe is the case. As we would go into these various vehicles of perception, there would be this accumulation that we would be a sum total of our embodiments or experiences. And that's a very Eastern perspective. But I like what you said before too. You made a very good soundbite, and I really respect your positioning on these things, because you're in the middle. You don't cast a stone on either side. You made a comment once. What was it? You said that religion, you don't have to be a religious person to be a good person. And you pointed out Stoicism and the Stoics, and it's a very good way of looking at things. But also, people can go to Amazon, they can go out there, they can get this book, but how can they find you? How can they find your YouTube channel? How can they get to your website? Where
I'm easy to find. Anybody can just, type me into the interwebs and I'm there. I'm available. I appreciate you contacting me, and I'm happy to talk with people. Somebody wants to talk further on, especially about any of the books or any ideas there. I'm always happy to talk with people.
Well, let's do it. Can we get you back on the show again to explore some more of these fascinating
Oh,
subjects?
sure. Oh,
I
I'm
love
happy
that.
to, Johnny.
And
Oh, yeah.
everybody out there, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you, Johnny.